When I created these deep questions, I went through several iterations because I played it with a lot of different people. And in this video, I want to share with you some of the best practices, some of the things that I've learned that make great conversations, really allow you to create those meaningful connections with your friends, with your family, with strangers, or even if you play by yourself. So the first rule of playing deep questions is that you create your own rules. Yes, there is a card with some simple instructions in here, and I'm sharing a lot of the things I've learned in this video, but honestly, you can use the cards any way you want, and if you create your own rules, that's amazing. But there's a few things that I would like you to keep in mind if you want to create the best experiences for the people that you play with. There's 48 questions in each deck, and the ideal size of a group to play this with is maybe around 6 people or less. So if you ever play with more people with a bigger group, maybe split them up in smaller groups and do something at the beginning and something at the end that brings people together and share, because if you have a bigger group, it might just take a very long time before you make the round of everybody sharing their answers. And of the 48 cards, there's going to be 3 different levels. The first one is the yellow cards, which is the curious card. And those questions are great to get comfortable, and I would suggest that anytime you play with people for the first time, or especially if you play with strangers, use these cards first, because they will just help you get started, warm up, get your feet wet before you move on to the more deeper questions. And a lot of times the way I explain the curious cards is if there was a surface level conversation and anything like small talk is above the surface, curious questions would just be below the surface of the water. The second level is the blue cards, which are the brave cards. And once you've gotten a little bit more comfortable with the curious cards, you can move on to these questions, and they just invite you to share more personal stories and insights and experiences and get you closer to the goal of sharing vulnerable stories, which is the third level. The red cards are the vulnerable cards, and I created this as the deepest level of questions because of Brené Brown's quote that vulnerability is the birthplace for connection. And I actually think that the goal of each game should be to get to the point where you feel comfortable sharing those type of stories, because they will make you connect the quickest. These questions might make you a little bit uncomfortable. Those are questions that you might not have ever asked yourself, let alone shared with anybody else. So before you get to the vulnerable questions, make sure you create the right environment with the group that you're playing with so everybody feels comfortable. I actually believe if you bring the game to a group of friends or to your family, it's your job to create this safe space that everybody feels comfortable in and not pressured to share something that they don't want to share in front of those people. So here's a couple of tips on how to create this safe space. One of the first things that I tell people is everybody picks and answers their own question. So instead of me picking a question and asking my question to you and you have no way to prepare for it, I like to play it where I pick my own question, I have a chance to read it by myself first before I share it and read it out to everyone else. And I also give people the opportunity, if they are really uncomfortable sharing the answer to their question, to put it back and pick another card. But the big thing is, as I'm very interested in self-growth and self-development, and I think a lot of the people who will be playing with these cards like you are as well, take a moment before you put a card back and ask yourself, why does this question make me uncomfortable? What is it, like, is there something else that maybe I would like to share with the group? And sometimes it ends up with you sharing a story that is not answering the question directly, but it's still a thought that you had as soon as you read it. And sometimes that first thought, there is a reason why that thought pops up. And maybe there's a way you can share something about that, or maybe share why you feel uncomfortable about answering a question instead of actually answering it, and just see what happens. And remember, there are no wrong answers. Sometimes when you pick up a card, all you want to do is spend like 10 minutes journaling on it and organizing all your thoughts before you're ready to present your perfect answer to the group that you're playing with. But that might not be the best way to connect with others. Remember, this is not about having the perfect answer to your question. It's about including others in the process that you're going through and sharing that. And sometimes that becomes even more powerful if you don't know the answer to your question and you just start sharing the thoughts that come up, because when we share things out loud, the thoughts that we have in our head, it actually gives us a lot more clarity and insights by just the process of it. The best answers are stories. We've been sharing stories from the beginning of time, and it's the way we connect with each other the fastest. So instead of just answering a question really short and keeping it brief, think about an experience that you have, a lesson that you've learned, some story, some personal experience that you can share that answers the question. And always answer why. Sometimes we can even have a surface level conversation for a deep, meaningful question. But once we start answering the why, behind why we decided to answer the question in a certain way, that's where we get to the really deep, meaningful reasons and values. And as the person listening to somebody else's story, you have a really important job, which is to be present, to listen, and to ask follow-up questions. So one thing that I actually recommend you do as a group, maybe you can even come up with some sort of ceremony where you all put your phones on silent, or actually put your phones away so they don't interrupt when you're playing and nobody's tempted to check their messages or look on their phone when somebody else is sharing a story. Because the thing that makes these conversations so much more powerful is that you have a group of people that give you 100% of your attention. And that's something that is really rare. And we all want to be seen and heard. And the best way to feel seen and heard is if you have others that are listening, that are actually interested in what you're talking about. So if you're listening to somebody else sharing a story, ask follow-up questions, dig deeper, because that's how you get to the gold, to the places where you didn't even think you'd go when you started playing the game. And although sometimes I call it a game, there is no winner in this game. The goal of playing deep questions is to connect with the other people that you're playing with, and not having the best answer or giving the fastest answer, or not even having everybody share around and getting to the vulnerable questions. Sometimes that's just not what happens. And I've played with people where everybody wanted to share their answer to one question. And that's what we did for a whole hour. And that's exactly the right thing to do. So just be open to what happens. Go with the flow. If people want to share more stories about one question, then stick with that. Don't try to force it to get through all the questions, because you can always schedule another get-together with your friends or your family and continue with the next level the next time you see them. I've talked a lot about how you can play deep questions with other people, but I've actually been taking the questions to this writers group that we meet every week in the morning to write. And I'm a person that likes to journal in the morning. So every now and then, I don't really have a starting off point about what to journal about. So I just pick a random card, and that's the question that I'm going to start journaling on. So if you want to connect more with yourself rather than with other people, you can just use that as a question that you ask yourself. Ask yourself a question a day, a question a week. There's 48 questions, so there's a lot to explore. And sometimes you will find a lot of different answers for the same question depending on when you ask it. Okay, and the last thing I would like to share with you today is that when I was packing the questions, I had this moment where I thought about all the conversations that are about to happen when people get those cards in their hands and they start playing with their friends and their family and strangers or by themselves. And I'm really excited to hear your experiences, hear the stories of what happens when you play this game. So please feel free to shoot me an email, send me a message on social media. You can find Ask Deep Questions on Facebook, we're on Instagram, or if you want to just share something publicly, we would love to get in front of more people and hear their answers to the questions. So there's a hashtag on each card, which is Ask Deep Questions, and we would love to see what comes out of it. Okay, now go and find the first group of people that you're going to invite to have deep conversations with. And I wish you a very connected playtime. No. Have fun connecting.